So I've been making these cinematic Instagram reels for the past couple of years, and some of them have gotten millions, if not tens of millions of views. And by far the most common question that I get in my DMs, in my comments, in my mailbox and email, everywhere, is which camera do you use? And obviously what that really means is which camera should they buy if they want to make reels. And in this video I will explain my thoughts and opinions on what is currently in 2024 and beyond probably the best camera to make Instagram reels with. First of all, it depends on exactly what kind of reels you're planning to shoot and whether you prioritize workflow and convenience over like the absolute best possible quality. For me, I have two primary cameras. The first one, which usually surprises a lot of people when they hear or learn that like the majority, maybe 70% of my reels, if not more, have been shot on the iPhone. I started shooting the iPhone 13. Before that, I always used an Android. But ever since I got the iPhone 13 back when it came out, I was really amazed by especially the stabilization ability of the iPhone. But now with the iPhone 15, you have Apple Log, so you can shoot log footage that you can then color grade like you would any other like professional camera video. Honestly, even now it's kind of an underrated camera. It is the most convenient, and depending on the type of reels you want to make, the quality difference between an iPhone and a proper camera is barely noticeable a lot of the times. And you know, the benefits far outweigh the maybe 10-20% loss in quality that you get compared to, let's say, a Sony FX3. But then again, I also do have a Sony FX3 and I occasionally shoot on the Sony FX3. The real reason I own this camera is not for reels, of course. It's because I have a YouTube channel. I like to film higher production quality stuff, make short films even. And the three primary reasons why you would want to use a Sony FX3 or a similar cinema quality camera for even making reels is, first of all, the extreme low light performance improvements. It has a dual base ISO. The other ISO, the highest ISO that it goes is 12,800. And pair that with a low aperture lens and you can basically see in the dark. It's really impressive how this camera can see almost anything with fairly high quality at that ISO point. But perhaps even more noticeably, the second reason to use an FX3 is just the depth of field. And especially if I'm shooting like cinematic portraits or anything with people as the primary subject, I'm gonna want that depth of field. It just looks better in my opinion. So, you know, on a landscape or street footage, you're not really gonna notice the depth of field most of the time, unless you focus like really close. But then on a portrait like this, for example, it is so much more noticeable. Or a close-up shot of something else, it does add a little bit of like cinematic look to your stuff. And the third reason to use an FX3 is higher frame rate, especially in lower light. If you want to shoot 60 FPS and slow it down, or 120 FPS and slow it down, the iPhone is really going to start struggling, especially in low light, because then you have to ramp up the shutter speed in order to capture a higher frame rate, at least ideally. Without motion blur, you have to ramp up the ISO much higher. And again, this camera goes up 12K ISO. The iPhone starts struggling around even 2000 really. So slow motion is really much better on the FX3 or an equivalent camera. But no, of course, the stabilization, even with active stabilization and gyro stabilization technology, the iPhone is just more stable handheld. So if you want to get super stable footage on an FX3, you're probably gonna have to use a gimbal, especially if you want a long take. You can kind of get away with, 1 or 2 seconds handheld, but it's still better on the iPhone. I've tested this many times. And then the workflow. An iPhone, it is still theoretically, even with Apple Log, possible to have an entirely phone-based workflow, which it's just for me more chill and easier and simpler because you're posting on a phone, you see the work environment on the phone, you can edit on the phone. But then with an FX3, you have to go onto the computer, import the footage, edit it. I've noticed the Mac screen is slightly more contrasty than the iPhone screen, but I'm posting on an iPhone, so I want the footage to look best on an iPhone because that's how most people are gonna view it on Instagram and stuff. So then there's a bunch of back and forth and a little bit of a consistency issue. It just takes much longer and it's much clunkier. So is it really worth it? Yes, if I'm making a portrait video, like I said, or on any of those other features. But for the vast majority of the footage that I do, an iPhone is already enough. And as it keeps getting better and better, is probably continue being the ideal choice for Reels. Now, of course, I've only given you 2 camera options here. There's plenty of cameras to choose from. Unfortunately, I'm not the biggest camera expert because you have to constantly just look at the stats and keep up with the news. The FX3, for me, it is the perfect, like, serious cinema camera. It is very popular for a reason. But if you want to get a Nikon or a Fuji, that's really not going to make as much of a difference as just, you know, the 3 reasons that I just mentioned earlier in this video, whether you choose a phone or a cinema camera like that. So hopefully this explains the reasoning in which camera you should buy. But before I end the video, I just want to say the old thing that I always say and everyone always says, it is not which camera, but how you use it, and also how you edit the footage. Luckily, this channel has, or at least will have, a bunch of tutorials on the topic of editing your footage as well, because that is what really maximizes it. So if you're interested in that, check out the other videos as well. Thank you for watching.